The phone call cut through the ordinary hum of my kitchen like a thrown pot. It was a thin thing, Madison's voice too bright for what she was saying. "We already got married," she said, like she was reading from someone else's script. "We figured it would be easier this way. Don't worry, just send the keys to the beach house. It's easier for us that way." For a long minute, I stood there with a wooden spoon in my hand and the lasagna in the oven ticking like a clock. The house smelled of tomato and oregano, the kind of smell that always brought Madison running, the smell that had been part of every summer at the Cape since she was small enough to hide under the kitchen table. The beach house, my beach house, was a family thing. It wasn't a thing you sent like a casserole. I didn't know whether to laugh or to weep. I chose silence until her voice softened. "Mom, are you there?" I put the spoon down and heard how ridiculous it sounded, my heartbeat colliding with the ordinary kitchen sounds. I heard the history of that house in my head. Summers of sand between toes, her father's laugh at the grill, the stubborn blue shutters my father swore he didn't need to paint, but finally did anyway. Robert had left it to us when he died, tucked into the estate with a clause in his will that the house remain in the family for future generations. It was where Madison learned to skip rocks and to patch bicycle tubes, and where we buried a time capsule under the boardwalk planks. It was also, I realized, in a cold, small voice inside me, leverage. It made someone desirable. "Madison," I said, "you're telling me you weren't going to invite me to your wedding?" There was a tiny hitch in her laugh. "It wasn't the kind of thing we wanted. Private. Tell Aunt Janet I send my love. Please, Mom, the lawyer said handling it smooth is better for everyone. We've already arranged the transfer. Just send the keys." I did what a lot of people do when the world shifts in an instant. I reached for something factual. "What lawyer?" She rattled off a name I'd never heard. I made a note of it anyway, an old habit from years of managing hospital discharge paperwork. Names, numbers, dates. It felt absurd, the way a nurse's brain holds on to logistics, even while grief or shock or whatever it was settles in. "Is this about the photographer?" I asked, flapping at straws. "No, Mom. It's about starting fresh. We don't want drama." And then she said, with an ease that made my spine go cold, "We already celebrated with a friend. It was small." Small. No invitation. Send the keys. It was the kind of cruelty that doesn't throw a punch so much as rearrange the furniture of your life. I thought about the time she'd learned to ride a bike without training wheels, how she'd pedaled down the driveway with her arms wide, expecting me to be right there, and how I'd been there, bonneted and cheering, holding my breath until she made it. I thought of lasagna nights. I thought of the recipe cards in my drawer with oil stains and penciled-in notes, less salt, more basil. Those cards were the same kind of inheritance as the house. They weren't for handing over at someone's convenience. I wondered, briefly, if I'd missed something obvious. Maybe they'd eloped in some romantic, impulsive way and were asking a practical favor. Maybe there'd been a fight. Was I that person? The mother who smothered? Maybe I'd overstepped. But Madison had always been honest with me, even when she'd been a teenager and locked me out of her college dorm one week for reasons that would later seem trivial. She'd sent postcards and called in the small hours. This was different. There was a coolness in the request, an instant logistics-first tone that didn't fit my daughter. I told myself to breathe. I told myself to sit. I told myself to ask questions that mattered. Who else was there? Did anyone sign anything? Is Trevor? She cut me off. She called him by his name as if it were a shield. "Trevor's fine. Look, we're happy. That's really all you need to know. Please, don't make this harder." There was a pause at the end of that sentence, like a hinge closing. I hung up and did what mothers do when the ground shifts. I tried to gather the pieces I could name. I texted Janet. I scanned our shared photos, beach house pictures, grainy Polaroids of Madison with wild hair and an ice cream cone, Robert with his arm around my shoulder, the blue shutters glinting in June light. I felt 18 years and 70 in the same breath. If you like true stories like this and want honest, unvarnished ones where grief and grit sit at the same table, subscribe. I'll tell you the rest. Madison had met Trevor in the way people met in this decade. Two blurred lives sliding into stronger focus through the geometry of screens and carefully curated dates. They'd had mutual friends, a few dinners, an evening at a gallery opening where Trevor had arrived late in a suit that looked as if it had been tailored for a photograph. I remember the first time I met him. He brought roses, and they were the sort that weren't too pink, the sort with a quiet, calculated elegance. He kissed my daughter gently, like he'd rehearsed it for an audience. He asked me about my lasagna recipe, then complimented my hands as if he knew domestic work was sacred, in heartbreak and in bread. At first, I liked him. He was polite, which is not the same as being genuine, but it was a good start. He laughed at the right moments, called my sister by name, and seemed to know which family stories were safe and which were off limits. He drank coffee black and listened to the vinyls Robert used to play. He told me that he liked Cape Cod in the off-season because it felt authentic. He said several times in the first 2 months, "Your beach house, what a treasure." He said it like he meant it, and he said it so often that it lodged in the air between us. There were small things at the edges. The first time I noticed it, he brought up the beach house with a kind of precision that felt rehearsed. "You must have so many memories there," he said at dinner. He asked casually how the title was held, as if discussing title and deeds was the small talk of a Sunday brunch. When I brushed it off, he offered a compliment about the shingles. I remember thinking, mildly amused, that he knew how to flatter. Then, at a neighborhood barbecue, he told a story about his grandfather. There was a picture of his family in his wallet, a man with stern eyes and hands like tools, and he spoke about legacy with an intimacy that made my skin prickle. "My grandfather always said houses hold memories," he said, "but they also hold stories people want to control." I laughed nervously, and he smiled the smile people show to make light of serious things. He was, I thought, both affectionate and a little too keen on the idea of being needed. I should have noticed more. As mothers, we compile a ledger of small observations and reconcile them into patterns when necessary. Recurring lateness, a new friend who never quite met your eyes, and insistence that your involvement is invasive. The pattern started as a single line. Trevor called Madison 3 times in an hour once to ask if she was free for dinner. Another time he took her phone away during a family Zoom call, gently. "Let's have our own time," he said, and I felt something contract in my chest. He began to isolate her with a velvet hand. The tactic wasn't dramatic, it was steady. He praised her independence and then turned that praise into a wedge. "You don't need anyone holding on to you," he said. "Sometimes family means you need to cut the ties that smother." He framed boundaries as if they were evidence of trust, but boundaries, as I learned, are a double-edged sword. He invoked them frequently. "We're building something just for us. All my relationships are simple and honest. You'll see, once you're with me, you'll feel free." I watched as the small rituals of our family life changed. She'd stop answering when I called during the day. Texts went unanswered for hours. She began to miss the weekly Sunday dinners at my sister's place. "Work obligations," she said. Once, she didn't show up for her father's memorial. "Trevor and I talked about it," she explained stiffly. "We needed time." "Time for what?" I asked later, to no one and to myself. What I didn't realize at first was that he had a script for charming people and a second script for isolating them. He complimented Aunt Janet in person and vilified her as clingy on calls, typical gaslighting phrasing I didn't recognize then. He called me overly protective and praised Madison's need to start her own chapter. If you're reading this and you've been through it, you'll know that language like "starting my own chapter" is a neat tool. It sounds emancipatory. It can be used to justify closing a door. It was the social media reveal, an engagement post that showed a ring and a sunset and two people whose faces smiled in a way that suggested rehearsed joy that truly hurt. I scrolled that afternoon, having expected a candid wedding invitation or at least a heads up. Instead, there it was. Madison's profile picture changed, a small ring emoji in the caption, the word official in a font that suggested celebration. No phone call, no "Mom, I wanted to tell you," just a digital announcement. Some people find out through a call. I found out through an app. The image they posted was beautiful and doled out public intimacy like coin. I felt invisible. I felt removed. A week later, I received an invitation addressed to family, but it was a PDF with a polite note. "Due to personal reasons, we will limit attendance. We appreciate your understanding." No date, no location, no explanation. I called Maddie. She didn't answer. I texted. "I love you," I wrote. A heart. No response. The exclusion wasn't abrupt. It was a weather pattern, slow, incremental, until the storm had rearranged the landscape. He reframed my concern as clinginess. He painted himself as the reasonable one. He told Madison that it was better this way. Our relationship could remain untouched by the drama of weddings and traditions. "You can always have your own celebration later," he said. "That's what matters." I began to collect things, not out of paranoia, but because a memory is easier to defend when you can show the receipts. I took screenshots of posts, printed emails, scribbled dates on the back of greeting cards. I kept a log of calls. I kept notes, like a nurse who charts everything. There was a turning moment that felt small at the time, but would later become a hinge. Madison and Trevor came to dinner one evening. Trevor had a way of moving through a room like he belonged to a film set. Everything slightly composed, everything precisely lit. Over lasagna and stories, he brought up the house again. "You know, that place could be so much more," he said. "A rental, a business. There are so many ways to use something like that." I nodded, too polite to say what I thought. "It's part of our family," I said. Robert made sure it stayed that way. Trevor smiled like it was an endearing anecdote. "That's wonderful, but sometimes families need to evolve." He spoke of efficiency, of bad management, of taxes. He suggested gently that keeping a house empty a large portion of the year was a waste. I felt a prickle. I tucked it away as worry. After that night, things accelerated. Invitations stopped. She stopped inviting me into the events that actually mattered. She defended him when I pushed, saying that he just wanted what was best for their future. "He's organized, Mom. That's a good thing." She used organized like a talisman. I started looking at public records. It began as a practical itch. If someone mentions the legal status of a property casually over lasagna, you check the county records. I wanted to know we were safe. It was a mother's reasonable check. I pulled up the municipal portal and typed our address. Ownership was what I expected. Carol Winslow and the estate of Robert Winslow, joint tenants. There was nothing unusual, no transfer, no lien. The idea that someone could just take the house felt absurd. But then I noticed a name in a registration for a small LLC that had used the beach house as a mailing address for a very brief period 2 years ago. It was attached to a property management company I'd never heard of. The manager's name was Marcus Webb. I printed the registration because it sat there, waiting like a loose thread. Over the next month, I scraped together little things. A dinner receipt with Trevor's name on it in a nearby town, social media cross-connections to a group of people who all had a history with similar houses, women who mentioned fresh starts and professional partners and legal advice. I would find nothing that screamed criminality at first glance, just a trail of perfectly plausible breadcrumbs. But breadcrumbs can lead to the oven. If I'm honest, I didn't start with the intention of building a case. I started with the intentions of a worried mother wanting to protect a home. But worry can be an engine. The more I looked, the more I found. Public records were a map. Newspaper clippings formed a pattern. Once you begin to see patterns, your brain finds ways to make them whole. I reached out to a friend of mine. Janet knows people. She put me in touch with Patricia Winters, an estate attorney with a steady voice and a folder full of legal pads. Patricia typed my name into a database and then told me, calmly, to breathe. "We'll look into the title chain," she said. "Start with the obvious, then widen the circle." Her voice had the quality of someone who had seen this before, not the specifics. No two schemes are identical, but the rhythms of them. I also asked about Marcus Webb. Patricia's eyebrows did something professional. "I know that name," she said. "He's listed in a couple of LLC filings, not in our county, but he's been connected to property management operations before. Nothing criminal on his public record, but appearances aren't proof. Keep your notes." I hired a private investigator. Hiring him felt at first like betraying my own instincts. Part of me had wanted to take the high road, to voice my concerns to Madison and let love do its work. But the written invitation, the curt voicemail, the repeated mentions of the beach house, those were not the language of love. A private investigator, I told myself, would bring clarity. I would not become the person who barge steps into my child's life. I would gather facts quietly and bring them to light if necessary. When the PI's first report came, it was a slow unspooling. He was a soft-spoken man named Luis who preferred earthen coffee to small talk. He brought me prints of public records, a list of names, and a short note. Patterns emerge. He'd tracked Trevor's past associates. He'd found two women, Emma Chen and Sarah Walsh, whose social media posts suggested abrupt endings to relationships in which finances had become complicated. He'd located a Miami attorney named Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been copied on an estate transfer once linked to Trevor's grandfather. Luis stressed that social media is an imperfect mirror. Still, he sent me a photograph. Emma, younger, smiling with a caption that read, "Starting over." That phrase kept appearing. It only meant something when it appeared again and again. Emma and Sarah, two names that would later be essential, were cautious on the phone. At first, they wanted nothing to do with my curiosity. Then they wanted something to be done. Their voices were careful, like people building the next layer over a cracked foundation. Emma told me about a sudden move, a shell company, and an insistence that she keep her personal affairs separate. Sarah described a fiancé who loved her independence until he didn't. They mentioned Marcus Webb in passing, once each, and both of them used the phrase tight social circle to describe the men who drifted through their lives like satellites. One of the strangest things about discovering manipulation is how ordinary the details are until they accumulate and become uncanny. Trevor donated to local charities and showed up at school concerts with a bouquet. He offered to manage a small home improvement project at the beach house and then apologized when the timing didn't work. He advised Madison to bypass Aunt Janet's help on a new business idea because it muddles things. It was the slow, almost invisible erosion of my daughter's sources of support. There were other, stranger finds. In a news clipping from 3 years earlier, a headline spoke of an accountant who had been caught transferring funds into an offshore holding connected to a now-defunct trust. The article mentioned a man with Trevor's grandfather's name. A probate dispute in another county showed a family fighting over control of an estate and a pattern of funds moving in odd increments. Names overlapped, like shading in a coloring book where no one is supposed to color outside the lines. The numbers, when I saw them on a ledger printout Louise gave me, made my stomach drop. $2.3 million, an initial shortfall in one estate, another file showing claims nearing $4 million in contested assets. These were dry facts on legal paper, nothing sensational, until you read them as a map pointing to someone who had access and motive. The numbers were not merely sums, they were places people had been taken from. They became anchors in my mind. 2.3 million here, a near 4 million claim there. I folded the photocopies into the folder I'd bought the week after the voicemail. The folder had a dent where the leather had bent, and it felt like armor of a kind. I told Madison I was concerned. She told me I was overreacting and that I was making things worse. The more I pushed, the more she retreated, until our conversation sounded like two trains passing at speed, brief signals exchanged without stopping. I wanted to tell her everything I'd found. I wanted to show her printouts, the emails, the names. But I feared that if I opened the folder, if I spilled the evidence on the kitchen table like a deck of cards, she would close off for good. She might think me cruel. She might close ranks. She might side with him entirely. So I chose a different strategy. I would prepare a thing she couldn't easily ignore, a quiet, careful presentation of what I'd found. I would not accuse her. I would not sling blame. I would lay out the facts and the resources, attorney contacts, the PI's notes, the names of two women who might corroborate patterns, and the numbers, because numbers are harder to dismiss than feelings. For weeks, I worked on the leather portfolio like a priest preparing confessional rites. I printed documents, photocopied public records, collected screenshots, and wrote notes in the margins. I included a one-page summary in plain language, what I had seen, the timeline I had constructed, and the people who might help. I placed Patricia Winter's business card inside with a brief note. If you want someone to talk to, she's familiar with estates and family transitions. I put Marcus Webb's registration and the LLC paperwork in there. I tucked in the PI's report and a list of bank transfers that, to an untrained eye, looked like a labyrinth. It felt theatrical, leaving a folder like that at a door. It also felt strategic. I wasn't staging a confrontation. I was making visible what had been hidden. If Trevor's goal was to isolate, this would be a way of piercing the isolation with information. It was also, I have to admit, a performative act. The folder was an argument made of paper. It would either open a door or burn it. I didn't know which. Madison texted me from time to time, little missives. Breakfast with a coffee emoji. Sorry, crazy day with a galaxy of icons. Once, she sent a photo of a small cake with 2 candles. Once, a video of Trevor and her laughing in a way that looked like a photograph someone had paused at. The texts were sound bites, not conversations. I started to feel like an outsider to my own daughter's joy, like someone watching a private movie through a slightly fogged window. There were moments of tenderness, too. I found a letter she'd written me when she was 14, tucked behind a cookbook, where she'd promised to never, ever leave me out of her life. That letter lived in the same drawer as the lasagna recipe, and I read it until the words blurred. I kept it with me like a talisman. The private investigator, Lewis, told me more than once to document everything and to let the professionals take their risky steps. He was careful to delineate what he could do in the bounds of the law and what he couldn't. He would follow paper trails and public records if they were public, but he would not, for instance, suggest or help in any illegal recording or entrapment. You keep us lawful, he said. We keep the evidence clean. That phrase, evidence clean, became my liturgy. Clean evidence is admissible. Clean evidence is the difference between a whisper and a verdict. We built a timeline. March, first dinner. June, the engagement post. August, new management LLC registration using the beach house as an address. September, Marcus Webb's registration. October, a small transfer documented in a probate file, $2.3 million listed as missing in connection with an estate where Trevor's grandfather had been an executor. November, nearly $4 million in claims filed in various estates that had overlapping names and shared a Miami attorney, Mr. Rodriguez. The names were like rivulets feeding into a river. My sister Janet became my confidant in small ways. Be careful, she told me. Janet had always been the practical one. She could disarm with a recipe or a smile, and she could also read a contract with the intensity of a detective. She suggested we write down what we knew and then step back to make sure we weren't letting fear lead. We need the facts, she said. No theatrics. Let the law do its work. So we did. We made lists, we cross-checked dates, we sent gentle, neutral messages to Emma and Sarah offering to meet and exchange notes. Both women agreed to speak privately. Marcus Webb, when confronted by a neutral inquiry from the PI, was brusque and evasive. He denied knowledge of any wrongdoing, but admitted to being involved in property management relationships where he knew other men who had married into money. His answer was neither a confession nor a denial. It was a deflection. I tried, in my quieter moments, to see Trevor as someone who had been loved into becoming himself. Maybe that's naive. Maybe it's human. I tried to remember that people are not merely their worst acts, but then you are faced with acts, and you must name them to protect the people you love. The folder grew heavier. I started to imagine a way to present it that was dignified rather than accusatory. I wanted Madison to see that I was not trying to take her joy away. I wanted her to know that my concern was for her safety and not a demand for an explanation. I wanted to give her the choice of looking, of accepting help. That was my final maternal calculus. Lay out the truth and give her the option to step in. If she chose not to, then the truth would be out there for others to see. At night, I dreamed strangely. I would wake with the scent of lasagna in my nose and the sound of waves. I was an anchor in a story that began at the shoreline and had, unexpectedly, a deeper current dragging under the sand. I thought about Robert and his quiet way of making sure his affairs were in order. He had been meticulous. If he were alive, he would have read a title and a trust and perhaps reached across the table and said, "Ask for the paperwork." I felt both the absence of his advice and the weight of his legacy. Then came the phone calls that made things concretely legal. Patricia Winter's called to tell me that she'd found a few anomalies in the probate files, entries that didn't line up with disbursements, and an obscure holding company listed in an offshore jurisdiction. She didn't say any sensational things. She spoke like a woman who had seen many will disputes and was careful to differentiate between suspicion and proof. "We need a paper trail that's admissible," she said. "If you want, I can reach out to an agent I know at the federal level. They can advise whether this falls under their purview." I remembered Agent Jennifer Liu from a conference where Patricia and I had both spoken about elder estates. Jennifer had a blunt way of asking clarifying questions. No drama, just steady curiosity. I felt, in that moment, a tired relief. There are institutions meant for this. The law is a plodding, sometimes slow-moving beast, but it exists to make sense of messy human affairs. Patricia made the call. Jennifer replied with the professional caution of someone who evaluates 100 threads a day. "Send me what you have," she asked. "We'll take a look." Her email arrived the next morning, short, crisp, professional. It felt like a rope thrown into the water. The rope did not guarantee rescue, but it meant my voice had reached the right place. Madison's responses to my quieter attempts at connection were still fleeting. She sent a gif of a sunset. She sent a red heart. Once, she asked me a question about a menu. I answered. We exchanged little things like flotsam. We had not yet had a real conversation. Meanwhile, the mental arithmetic was constant. Who stood to benefit from the beach house? Who had influence over Madison's decisions? How did words like boundaries get weaponized into exclusion? If someone removes a person from the family circle, they weaken the scaffolding that keeps a person anchored. My role as her mother had become contested, not out of malice necessarily, but out of someone else's design. I did not know whether Trevor's aim had been the house from the start or whether he had fallen into a pattern of predation. What I knew was that the house mattered to us in ways that were not simply financial. It was a repository of memory and continuity. It represented a line through which a family could cross generations. It felt terrible to have it mentioned like a menu item. There came an afternoon in late October when the wind pushed in from the coast and the house seemed to creak with a sense of urgency. I set the portfolio on the kitchen table under the lamp's warm light. I wrote a short, plain letter to Madison on cream stationery. I did not accuse, I did not beg. I wrote the facts as I had them, and I listed the names of people who could help. Patricia Winters, who would review estate questions. Agent Jennifer Liu, who would review whether a federal violation had occurred. Emma and Sarah, who had agreed to share their experiences if Madison wanted to speak with them. I included the PI's report. I left the folder with a note. I love you. When you are ready, please look. I thought briefly about leaving it on the porch like an ultimatum. I thought briefly about simply handing it to her over coffee and watching her hands shake. I chose the porch because it would be private, and because porch is where my daughter always paused before heading into the house as a child. I left it where she would see it, but where it wouldn't be spectacle. I imagined her picking it up and reading, and then pausing, and then calling me. After I placed the portfolio by the door, I made tea and sat very still. The day seemed to hold its breath. I thought absurdly of the lasagna still in the fridge and how mundane acts of care sometimes seem like the only tether to normalcy. I tried to be patient. The phone rang that evening. It was Trevor. His voice over the line had a taut note to it, equal parts surprise and annoyance. "Is Madison home?" he asked. "She's out running errands," I said. There was a pause that stretched. "I don't appreciate strangers leaving things on a doorstep," he said. "It's invasive." "It was an envelope," I said. "A mother leaving a folder for her daughter, nothing more." The line went still. I could almost imagine him arranging his words like someone adjusting a collar. "If you're interfering in our life, that's not helpful. You need to respect our decisions." "My question," I said, keeping my voice steady, "is what you think gives you the authority to exclude a mother from her daughter's wedding and then to ask for the keys to a family home." There was a sharp breath. "That's none of your business," he said. "We made a choice, that's all." "And asking me to hand over the house," I pressed. "Who asks a parent to send the keys to a house she still owns?" There was a quiet I didn't like. Then, "You're making a scene, Carol," he said, and hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand, the porch light casting long yellow shapes across the table, the lasagna lonely in its pan. I felt enraged and small at once. The audacity of being told to send my house by someone who had smiled and eaten at my table weeks earlier was a bruise to the ribs. The fact that he'd said it so casually felt almost obscene. I called Patricia and left a message. I emailed Agent Liu and attached a redacted file of the notes I'd gathered. I texted Madison. "I'm here when you want to talk. Love you." 3 dots. Nothing filled them. There are moments in which fear and love sit across from each other and trade barbs. I was afraid for my daughter's safety, not just because of money, but because isolation can be a prelude to much worse. I was afraid for my legacy, the thing Robert had tried to preserve. I was afraid that my daughter might be slipping from me like a small boat that doesn't realize it has drifted away until the anchor line has frayed. I was also stubbornly, indignantly hopeful. I knew where the evidence might lead once it was assembled properly. I knew there were women who had been through things and would speak. I knew there were institutions that could step in. That night, as I lay awake, I thought of the beach house in a new way. It had always been sanctuary. Now it represented a crossroads. It would either be taken as a trophy or defended as a legacy. I pictured it painted in the golden light of the afternoon, the sea salt air smelling of promise. I could see Madison dancing on the back deck at a future wedding where she would invite me and where there would be lasagna on the kitchen table and her father's laugh in the photographs. I wanted that future to be real. In the morning, I woke with a plan that felt like a map. Collect, document, consult, and, if necessary, bring the proper authorities into the orbit. I made coffee and spread the documents across the table like an investigator who'd been given permission to look. Lewis called with a new tidbit. Marcus Webb had been seen meeting Trevor at a cafe in town. Emma and Sarah had agreed to meet in a neutral place if Madison ever wanted to hear them out. Patricia had arranged a preliminary call with Agent Levieux for the following week. I also wrote another short note to Madison. It was not grand. It said, "I love you. You are not alone. There are people who can help if you want them. Please remember you can change your mind about any of this." I put it in an envelope and tucked it inside the leather portfolio. I didn't know at that point whether the folder would lead to a conversation that healed or to a conversation that ruptured us further. I only knew I could not be complicit in silence. The beach house deserved a defense that was more than sentiment. My daughter deserved the chance to see what the future might look like without blinders. So I waited, and in that waiting, I prepared for the next step. The step where the paper would be handed to someone with authority to act, where the PI's work would be validated by law, where a federal agent might lean forward and ask the right questions. I imagined sitting in a sterile office, the sun falling through blinds, and saying the things I'd written down aloud, watching faces register facts and move. When the phone rang that afternoon, I almost didn't answer. My hands were damp from wiping the counter. My heart had a tick in it that felt like anticipation more than fear. The name on the screen wasn't Madison. It was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, telling myself I would listen later. The voicemail was short and unfamiliar, a clipped voice saying, "This is Agent Jennifer Liu. I reviewed your materials. We need to talk. Please call," and then a number. I sat down hard enough that the cupboard door rattled. The kettle hissed at the stove, forgotten. The world seemed to tilt toward action. The rope was being gripped on both ends. I called back. Her voice was direct. "Mrs. Winslow, I appreciate the way you've organized this. If you can come in with the physical copies, we'll look through them. From the notes I've seen, there appears to be a pattern that merits opening a preliminary inquiry." A what? The legal term felt like a ladder rung I had to climb. "A preliminary inquiry," she said. "It means we look at the files and see whether we have grounds to open a formal investigation. It doesn't mean anything decisive yet, but it's the right step. In the meantime, keep communication with your daughter as neutral as possible. Don't record conversations, those are evidentiary risks, and avoid anything that could be construed as coercion. Let the professionals move where necessary." Her counsel was calm and precise, exactly the thing I needed, and also exactly the thing that made the situation feel more acute. "So this could go somewhere," I said. "It could," she said, "and it could not, but from what I've seen, it's worth a look." We scheduled a meeting. Patricia would come with me. Louis would deliver a binder of his notes. Patricia, Louis, and I sat in a small conference room at the federal office 2 days later, the afternoon light slanting across a stack of photocopies that had once been my kitchen table. Jennifer Liu had a notebook open, a pen poised, and the kind of steady look that makes you feel like the facts are safe in her hands. She glanced at the binder Louis had brought and then at me, and for a moment the hum of the building outside felt like ocean noise far off in the distance, steady and indifferent, but there nonetheless. "We'll open a preliminary inquiry," she said again, matter of fact. "From there, we decide whether there's enough for a formal investigation." Her voice was brisk, not unsympathetic. "We'll need chain of custody for anything your PI collected. Any documentation must be handled in a way that preserves admissibility." Louis explained how he'd gathered his notes, public records, photographed receipts, and copies of LLC filings. Patricia nodded at the probates and the clipped news articles we'd put together, showing that thread of transfers and contested estate claims, $2.3 million in one account, nearly $4 million in proximate claims across other files that intersected by name or attorney. Jennifer's eyes narrowed at the numbers, then softened. "We've seen patterns like this where an individual or family network exploits estate processes across jurisdictions." That kind of coordination can be a predicate for federal money laundering and fraud charges, depending on the specifics. We'll need to pull bank records, subpoena documents, and, if we can, get witnesses to corroborate narratives. I watched her as she spoke, feeling a fierce and private gratitude mixed with a bone-deep anxiety. "What about Trevor?" I asked. "If he knows, if he's the one trying to get the house, what do we do in the short term? He already asked me to send the keys." Jennifer's pen paused. "Short term, keep communication civil and minimal. Do not confront. Do not record. Those 2 points are important. Let us handle the heavy steps." She looked at Patricia. "We'll set up a protective order if necessary and prepare for contact that needs law enforcement present." Then she turned to me. "We'll also need Madison's cooperation." The wait for Madison to agree felt like a separate kind of trial. She read the folder, eventually, because she is made of the same blend of stubbornness and practicality that runs in our family, and she let the pages sit on her lap at first, like something fragile or combustible. I could see the way her jaw moved as she read, and there were moments where she would glance up at me to search my face for motive, for duplicity, for a staged act. I had none to perform. My performance had been the lasagna and the years. I wanted her to see that not every intervention was a judgment. "What if I'm making a mistake?" she asked me one night, late, voice small through the phone. "What if I've given him the wrong idea?" "You aren't making a mistake," I said, and I meant it with the certainty of nights up with a sick child or the stubbornness of someone who'd watched a spouse plan a retirement. "You're asking questions. That's allowed." She agreed to meet Jennifer and Patricia at a neutral place. The first conversation with the agent was careful. Jennifer explained the limits and the tools. "We can't promise an outcome," she said, "but we can promise a thorough, lawful process. You'll be able to speak privately with witnesses, and we will consider the risks and benefits of every move." She laid down what it would mean for Madison to be involved. Interviews, potentially wearing a wire in a controlled meeting, and giving consent for law enforcement to use recorded conversations gathered in the operation. Madison listened, quiet. She surprised me by saying simply, "If it helps stop this from happening to someone else, if it helps protect my mom, then I'll do it." There was a new tilt to her voice, a clarity that felt like a long, disorienting fog. I remember gripping the edge of the table in our kitchen and letting my knuckles go white, trying to stay mindful of not collapsing into relief in front of her because I did not want to scare her with the full breadth of my fear. We met Emma and Sarah in a nondescript coffee shop. They were cautious, eyes skittish at first, but they had been through enough to recognize the pattern. They told their stories in clipped, careful tones, sudden moves, suggestions that family assets be consolidated under a new trust, vague references to business deals with a Miami attorney, then silence and odd transfers. They described being subtly cut off from their support networks, calls that went unanswered, sudden declarations that family ties complicated new lives. Marcus Webb's name came up in both of their accounts, always as someone who managed aspects of property or logistics, someone who could be conveniently available to implement an arrangement. "I don't want to be on display," Emma said, glancing at her hands, "but I don't want someone else to go through what I did." We planned, with Jennifer, to build the case from the documents out: bank subpoenas, estate accountings, emails, texts, and witness statements. The legal net widened and pulled taut when Jennifer's team obtained court orders to access records linked to Mr. Rodriguez in Miami. His name has shown up as a recurring legal contact in probate notes, and his law firm's records would show who had signed what and when. The paper trail, Jennifer explained, would be the backbone. "We need to follow the money," she said plainly. "If we can link transfers to coordinated efforts to hide assets, we have a strong predicate for charges, and that strengthens our options for restitution down the line." What I learned in those weeks was the perverse efficiency of bureaucracy in the service of truth. Subpoenas are not romantic. They arrive with a seriousness that is almost dull. stamped, formal, and unflashy. But they pull at the seams. Mr. Rodriguez's firm turned over files, billing records, draft trust documents, and signatures. When the Miami fabric was examined, we saw the same names as in the other counties, names that had seemed to float randomly across the years, now clustering like geese in migration. As the investigation grew, so did the stakes. We were careful in public. I held my tongue when neighbors asked about the engagement or when someone mentioned seeing the couple down at the marina. I tried not to let my fear become a howling thing in Madison's presence. But privacy has a way of making secrets feel heavier. The folder in my drawer felt like a patient waiting to be diagnosed. The decision to stage a controlled meeting, one in which Madison would wear a wire while law enforcement monitored and recorded, was not taken lightly. Jennifer went over the plan in full detail with us and with Lisa, the evidence tech who would handle the devices. There would be no deception by civilians, no entrapment. The law was clear that was not our role. The idea was to create an ordinary moment where Trevor might speak about what he thought was private, so that, if he incriminated himself, the recordings would be admissible because they were gathered within a lawful operation with proper supervision and consent. Madison surprised me with her steadiness during those final preparations. She practiced what she might say if the conversation drifted into territory she hadn't been expecting. She rehearsed neutral, non-leading phrasing. I watched her in the mirror one afternoon as she smoothed her hair and thought of the child who used to smear flour on her nose while helping me make lasagna. And I imagined that girl putting a microphone on her bra with a calmness I admired and a touch of mourning I couldn't stop. The meeting was arranged under the pretense of a reconciliation. Jennifer's team would be close, one agent in a parked car, another monitoring from a nearby cafe. Lisa would ensure the equipment was functioning and that the chain of custody was clear. Patricia stood at my shoulder throughout the process like someone with a steadying hand on a lifeline. Luis, the PI, was on call to provide any last-minute intelligence. We chose the apartment because it was neutral, a place Trevor rented for privacy that also had a living room with heavy curtains. Madison texted him asking if he might come by to talk about the keys situation, a phrase that sounded humbler than the thing it concealed. He answered quickly, "Sure, I'll be there," and in the hour before he arrived, the world seemed to hold its breath in a way only those who have waited for an outcome in which truth is battered by charm can understand. I waited downstairs in my car, hands folded around a paper cup of cold coffee, and listened for a sound I could not define. When the call came, not to me, but from Jennifer to say the recording was live and that agents were in position, my knees felt like a child's. What followed in the apartment was, in many ways, ordinary domestic talk. There were questions about the weather, notes about a new restaurant, the small exchanges that grease the wheels of a relationship. Then the folder came up. Madison had told him she'd found some documents and wanted to talk. Trevor's voice shifted. An edge came under the charm. "What documents?" he asked, and there was a brittle quality to it, as if a practiced smile were cracking. "I just want us to be clear," Madison said, voice steady, "about where we stand with the house. I thought you were thinking I could transfer it as part of our plans, but I'm not sure how that would work." There was a long, small silence, and then Trevor said something I will never forget. He spoke of leverage, of opportunities, of managing assets to avoid tax burdens. He used business words, trusts, liability, consolidation, in ways that, if he were only a sincere partner, would be dry and oddly pragmatic. But here, in a recorded moment, they had the feel of maneuvers rather than mere conversation. He talked about clearing the titles and making the house work, and then, unprompted, dangerous in the way that unguarded people become, he explained how such plans had been handled for others, how certain accounts had been moved, and how, if handled properly, it could be cleaned up. Jennifer's voice came through an agent's earpiece as calm instruction. Let him continue. Don't interrupt. Monica, keep it neutral. If he asks directly if Madison wants to go through with transfers, give him a conditional response. We're exploring options. Monica, Madison, kept her face like an ocean in calm weather. Trevor, leaning forward, unmasked in ways the law had been waiting for. He spoke of names that matched the outline of the files in the folder. He mentioned Marcus Webb and the Miami attorney in a way that connected the dots the printed documents had shown. He referred to a methodology he'd used in the past, phrases like, "We arrange the accounts under a different umbrella," and "We use intermediaries to make it less noticeable." Those were not legal terms, but the implication was plain. There was a moment when he even became flustered, then angry at the hypocrisy he sensed, as if the plan were no worse than business. He made comments that suggested he'd known about the transfer patterns and had coordinated steps with others when money needed to be moved. It was brittle and raw. He did not know in that moment that his words would be played in court later as a recorded confession. He thought himself in the privacy of a partner's apartment. He thought himself in the safety of what he called practical arrangements. When he asked, in the low, casual way he had used in our kitchen the night he first mentioned using the house as a mailing address for an LLC, "Isn't it easier if the property shifts?" Madison stayed silent. He spoke on. At the end of his tirade, part boast, part instruction, there was a sound that was more breath than voice. He said, "We've done it before. It's how things are handled." It was the moment that pushed the operation over the threshold. The agent in the parked car switched on the lights. Officers moved in with a careful choreography rehearsed to avoid any hint of civilian entrapment or improvisation. Trevor looked up, then around, and for a moment the charm dissipated like fog. He was arrested without incident. He kept his manners for a little while. "This is absurd," he said with a tone that tried to sound superior and wounded at once. But then the reality, handcuffs, the polite reading of rights, worked its way in. "I cried then, not out of glee, but because a long pressure that had lived in my chest loosened a fraction." The next days moved in a strange mix of administrative processes and a sober gravity. Trevor was booked, then released on conditions that the court set pending charges. The FBI and federal prosecutors reviewed their files, and then, with a kind of machine-like efficiency that only federal investigations possess, presented an indictment. The charges cited conspiracy, multiple counts of fraud, and money laundering, charges the prosecutors were clear would be argued with documentary evidence. The transfers, the interlinked LLC filings, the Miami attorney's records, and the recorded conversations. Marcus Webb was interviewed, and when confronted with his paper trail and the pattern of his contacts with Trevor, agreed to cooperate. He was not a magnificent character. He was ordinary in ways that made him useful. Someone who had done logistical favors, someone who could point to specific transfers and explain how accounts had been moved. He provided names, dates, and emails. In exchange for cooperation, his role would be clarified in plea bargaining. The legal team used his testimony to build a clearer timeline of the operations. Emma and Sarah provided victim statements that were private and fierce. They testified about the way the relationships had changed once money and organizational talk entered them. They spoke about trust and erosion and the disorienting aftertaste of being shut out. They did not make dramatic claims, they simply narrated the facts of what had occurred and the emotional cost. Mr. Rodriguez's documents were a turning point. The Miami attorney, when served with properly issued subpoenas, produced drafts of trust arrangements and billing records that linked the executions of certain documents to transfers into offshore accounts. The accounts themselves had layers, corporate shells, and intermediary banks that made the money harder to trace, but the pattern was visible. Funds diverted and, in some cases, used to provide living expenses or luxury items for those who were part of the arrangement. The prosecutors emphasized the scope. an initial documented $2.3 million discrepancy in one estate accounting, contested claims nearing $4 million across related probates, and an organizational web that suggested an $8 million total run of funds connected across jurisdictions. The trial was a sobering spectacle. It was not the kind of celebrity circus that television sometimes makes it out to be. Instead, it was a room where the quiet business of justice unfolded. Documents projected onto screens, witnesses sworn, cross-examinations that sometimes felt trivial and sometimes sharp, and a jury that listened with the care of people whose job it was to weigh two things: the words and the truth. The prosecution methodically reconstructed Trevor's pattern: charm to gain proximity, isolation to reduce interference, then legal and financial arrangements designed to shift assets. I testified. I told the court about lasagna nights and blue shutters and the small rituals that make a house a home. I described the day the voicemail came and how the folder had been prepared, not as an accusation, but as an appeal, and the way my daughter had been led down a path of quiet distance. I remember feeling the weight of the room press as I spoke, the jurors leaning slightly forward, the defense counsel pinched and polite. I kept to facts. Jennifer and Patricia and Luis were on the seats behind me like a careful chorus. Their faces encouraged me to be plain and to let the documents do the rest of the speaking. Madison read her victim impact statement in a voice that was steady and then breaking in the right places. She talked about feeling betrayed, about losing years to a relationship that had been hollowed out by someone else's agenda. It wasn't just about money, she said, voice catching. It was about my choices being questioned and my family being made to feel like an obstacle. I want to say to other women, if you feel cut off, if someone paints your family as the problem, that can be a red flag. You deserve people who support all of you. Emma and Sarah testified with the dignity of people who had rebuilt pieces of their lives. Marcus, under the pressure of cross-examination, admitted involvement and spoke about facilitating transactions in a tone that balanced responsibility and self-protection. The defense tried to undermine his credibility, but his testimony, corroborated by documents and emails, fit into the pattern the prosecution had laid out. The recorded conversation, Trevor's own words about moving funds and using intermediaries, was played in the courtroom. I watched his face as the jury listened. He watched himself too, and for the first time I saw him without the smooth veneer. There was a moment when he looked at me across the room, and whatever he had once thought was a shield, his charm, looked thin and used. The jury convicted him on multiple counts. I remember the foreperson's voice, low, the words meeting a kind of weathered silence. Trevor's reaction was not theatrical. He sat and then looked away. He would be sentenced to a custodial term and ordered to pay restitution. $8 million was the figure the court entered as the total restitution owed to victims across the connected cases. The restitution order was not a magic bomb. It was a legal recognition of the harm, a promise to make whole as far as the law could. It would be distributed across claimants through court-appointed receivers and trust mechanisms. The process would be slow, and some money would be unrecoverable. We understood that nuance. Justice, in this form, is often a staged negotiation between what was and what can be made right. After the conviction, there were meetings about restitution, accounting, receivership, and asset recovery. The government moved to seize certain accounts and to follow the money through its intermediaries. Mr. Rodriguez's documents proved critical in establishing timelines. Marcus's cooperation opened doors to accounts previously hidden. The court's restitution order named specific amounts and channels by which victims could file claims. Patricia guided us through each form and deadline with the steady patience of someone who had shepherded families through probate fights and wills for decades. The emotional work of healing was, of course, separate from legal outcomes. In the months after the trial, Madison and I rebuilt a different kind of intimacy. We went back to the things that had been constant in our relationship: letters tucked into drawers, a cookbook with splattered notes, the ritual of making lasagna together on Sunday afternoons. We spoke about betrayal in ways we hadn't before. She told me about the ways guilt and shame had wrapped themselves around her, how hard it was to feel like she'd missed the markings of something unfolding. You weren't the one alone, I reminded her. You weren't the only one who missed things. He was practiced at hiding them. We planned, when staggered daily life allowed, to bring the beach house back into the center of our lives. The legal title, which had been secure, was reaffirmed through the probate process, and the court recognized the estate clause that Robert had put into the will, that the house remain in the family. That clause had been persuasive evidence that the beach house was not a disposable asset. It was a legacy. Restitution proceeds began to trickle to claimants. The $8 million order did not mean a single check would resolve all pain, but it did mean the court acknowledged the economic wrong. We received word that a portion of recovered funds would be allocated to accounts to resolve debts and to repair some of the financial harm caused by the scheme. For many of the victims, Emma, Sarah, Madison, those funds represented practical relief and a form of acknowledgement that the harm had been legislated into remedy, however partial. Madison and I spent an afternoon at the beach house a few months after the trial. We walked the back deck and picked up shells like collecting small flags of home. The house, having been the axis around which so much had spun, was messy in that particular way old houses are. Paint chips, a fridge that hummed in a bass tone, faded photographs taped to the pantry door. We sorted old things, laughing and crying in equal measure. She found the time capsule we'd buried years ago, and we opened it, reading notes from younger versions of ourselves as if they were messages from a simpler era. "Will you come to my wedding?" Madison asked me then, and I understood why she might need to ask the question. The exclusion had left a scar that wasn't erased by an arrest. Forgiveness is not just a single motion. It is rewoven through repeated small gestures. "Yes," I said, "I will be there, and we'll cook lasagna for the reception. We'll call Janet to make the salad." I said it with a kind of careful joy that had weight. We both laughed, fragile, grateful. We didn't pretend everything was back to before. Trust takes time to rebuild. Madison took steps to secure her finances, to meet with counselors and support groups, and to collaborate with Emma and Sarah on outreach to other victims. They formed a small coalition to share resources and to warn others about patterns of predatory relationships that mixed emotional manipulation with financial planning. That collective action felt like an aftershock of the legal process, moving from private harm to public prevention. There were small legal aftershocks, too. Marcus testified under the arrangement the prosecution and defense had negotiated. Part of his plea involved cooperation and an agreed contribution to restitution. His testimony helped to bring closure to questions of mechanism, if not to the emotional questions every family has about why someone would choose deceit over honesty. In the quiet months that followed, the beach house again became a site of ordinary life. Coffee on the back steps, a stack of magazines, a slightly sagging porch swing. We put up new curtains and repainted the shutters that Robert had resisted. The house was still Robert's legacy, but it also became our shared project, Madison's and mine, an act of reclamation rather than simply possession. The community around us, neighbors who'd watched the drama like weather, came forward in small ways. A casserole dropped off, an offer to help with weekend projects, a friend to sit with us and watch old home movies. The experience taught me to be precise about what families are and what they are for. Protection, yes, but also the messy work of repair and the humility of listening when shame and regret enter a conversation. One afternoon, over coffee, Madison and I spread out photos and wedding plans. This wedding would not be the secret we already did it arrangement that had been devised in haste. It would be a day where names on a guest list mattered because people mattered. It would have lasagna because some rituals are stubborn and sacred. We sketched a guest list that included Janet, Emma and Sarah, Patricia, Luis, even Agent Lou, who once joked that she'd bring only courthouse-appropriate attire. We imagined a modest ceremony on the back deck with the ocean breathing behind us. Same shingles, new stories. There remains a residue to experiences like ours that only time can soften. There are days when the memory of Trevor's charm makes me flinch, and nights when I count my blessings like coins. There are practical things, legal paperwork, restitution accounting, continued checks on financial entanglements that require attention. There are also beautiful things, dinner parties with friends who had stood by us, new traditions, and the knowledge that Madison and I could speak plainly to each other again. If there's a lesson I hope people take from this, it is not a neat moral about punishment or an argument about who was right. It's a pragmatic one. Keep your facts close and your channels lawful. Trust your intuition enough to ask questions, and most of all, preserve the ties that give perspective. A predator's power comes in part from loneliness imposed on the victim. That is why the work of witnesses, Emma, Sarah, Marcus, and the role of lawful institutions, Agent Lou, Patricia, the federal prosecutors, made the difference between a private loss and public accountability. In the end, the beach house stood, weathered, a little salt-streaked, but upright, and it became a symbol of something more than the property it is. It was a testament to memory, to Robert's intentions, to lasagna nights, to a mother's stubbornness. It was also a place of new vows and new refusals to be used as a convenience. It was where Madison chose to have the wedding she wanted, with people who had seen her through the dark patches and who had helped her reclaim what was hers. We had the ceremony on a warm day, late in summer, with family and a small circle of friends. Madison walked down the back steps, and I felt every inch of the history the house held. We ate lasagna at long tables and told stories about Robert, some tender, some comic, and there was a sense of restoration that was not naive. We had been broken and we had been mended. The stitches showed, but they held. After the wedding, late that night, with the dishes piled and the lanterns dim, Madison and I sat on the deck and looked at the water. She leaned into me and said, "Thank you for not giving up." "You nearly made me," I said, laughing and crying in the same breath. "You gave me some good alarm bells, too." We were gentle with each other, finally, the way family is after a season that taught you to take nothing for granted. The beach house, which Trevor had named like a goal to be obtained, became instead a place to remember how unbuyable some things are: time, presence, shared history. There are aspects of the story that remain unresolved. Some assets remain difficult to trace, some bureaucratic angles take months or years to finalize. But the essential arc, exclusion turned to exposure, private harm turned to public consequence, isolation turned to reunion, has been set. We have sought restitution and accountability, and we have also sought to rebuild. I tell this not because I imagine myself heroic. I tell it because the ordinary decisions we make, keeping a log, speaking to a trusted attorney, asking an agent to listen, can be the difference between being quietly dispossessed and being legally heard. And because sometimes the people you love will be led astray by someone with a practiced friendliness that disguises an agenda. That does not make them culpable for being loved. It makes them human. If this story resonates with you, if you or someone you know has felt excluded from a family moment or pressured to give up something that felt permanent, please consider sharing your experience below. There is power in community, and sometimes the smallest acts, sending a message, seeking counsel, documenting a pattern, change the shape of outcomes. If you want more stories like this, subscribe and join us. There are more narratives of truth and recovery to tell, and I believe we learn better together. Thank you for listening to mine.